Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let us jump right in.
Yeah, let's go back to 1868. The King of Siam is standing deep in the humid southern jungles of the Malay Peninsula.
And he is not alone out there, right?
No, he is completely surrounded by invited Western scientists, diplomats, and astronomers. They are all just standing around, staring up at the sky, waiting for it to go completely dark.
Right, they're waiting for a solar eclipse.
Exactly. But the key here is that the king is not relying on, ancient court astrologers or traditional mysticism for this event. He used Western astronomy and complex mathematics to predict the exact time and location of this total solar eclipse himself.
Which is quite a statement.
It really is. And as the moon perfectly blocks out the sun, right on his strictly calculated schedule, he proves to those Western observers that he is an absolute master of their own sciences.
It is a perfect scene to start with.
Okay, let us unpack this, because this single moment encapsulates an entire era of history. You have a society fiercely rooted in ancient traditions of absolute kingship, but they are aggressively adopting modernization. And not just for progress. It was a crucial weapon for their survival.
Yeah, we are exploring the Rattanakosin Kingdom, which is widely known as the Kingdom of Siam. We are covering its foundation in 1782, right up to the Siamese Revolution of 1932.
And this is part of our History of Thailand series, right?
It is. This specific time frame within the series is defined by a constant, high-stakes negotiation of identity and sovereignty. The mission for our deep dive today is to guide you, the listener, through this profound transformation.
Because it is a huge shift.
Absolutely. We are looking at a state that literally pulled itself from the smoldering ashes of total war, operating as this traditional network of tributary states.
Yeah.
And it evolved into a highly centralized modern nation state.
And crucially, the kingdom navigated the aggressive global expansion of Western imperialism without ever falling to direct colonization.
Right. That eclipse expedition you mentioned illustrates the core strategy of the Siamese elite perfectly. They realized that to preserve their sovereignty, they had to internalize the administrative techniques, the sciences, and the tools of the encroaching European powers,
while simultaneously reinforcing their own cultural and political legitimacy at home.
Exactly.
So this deep dive will equip you with a highly nuanced understanding of the mechanics behind that survival. We're going to look closely at how they built an entirely new capital city from the mud up.
How they negotiated treaties that profoundly disadvantaged them just to stay alive.
Yeah, and how they radically dismantled and rebuilt their social structure. And eventually, how an 800-year-old absolute monarchy met its sudden end.
But to understand where they ended up, we really have to start at the absolute bottom.
Right, the year is 1782.
King Rama I, the founder of the Chakri dynasty, establishes a Bangkok. He makes a deliberate decision to move the capital from Thonburi, which sits on the west bank of the Chao Phraya River, across the water to the east bank.
To a small village called Bangkok, right?
Yes. And to understand the sheer gravity of this decision, you have to place yourself in the mindset of the Siamese leadership at the end of the 18th century.
Because they were essentially operating under this existential, ever-present threat from the Burmese to the west.
Right. The previous decades had witnessed the total catastrophic destruction of their ancient capital, Ayutthaya, by Burmese forces in 1767.
And Ayutthaya was not just a city. It was the cosmopolitan center of their universe, and it was burned to the ground.
So moving the capital across the river to Bangkok was a deeply strategic, entirely defensive calculation. By placing the new city on the east bank, the wide, treacherous flow of the Chao Phraya River itself was transformed into a formidable natural moat.
A moat against any Western invasion.
Precisely. Furthermore, the land on the east bank was essentially a sprawling expanse of low, swampy marshlands. The terrain itself provided an additional grueling geographic buffer that an invading army would have to trudge through.
I look at this undertaking, and it reminds me of a hermit crab finding a stronger shell after a close call with a predator. But the logistics of building a capital city in a swamp are just heavy.
Very heavy.
This was not just about establishing physical defense. This was a psychological reboot for a deeply traumatized society. They needed a physical manifestation of their resilience.
And they achieved that in a very literal way. They actually sent laborers upriver to the ruined, charred remains of Ayutthaya to salvage intact bricks from the destroyed palaces and temples.
Wait, they floated the old bricks back down the river.
Yeah, they floated them back down the river to construct the new city walls of Bangkok. They're literally pulling their future out of the rubble of their past.
It is a striking example of continuity. The new city was built with the very bones of the old empire.
And the labor force required to execute this vision tells us a great deal about the power dynamics of the region. The initial backbreaking work of digging the extensive defensive canal system and the inner city moats was primarily carried out by Lao and Cambodian laborers.
Right, laborers drawn from the outer spheres of Siamese influence.
Exactly. Once the physical defenses were secured, they immediately turned to the spiritual fortifications. The Grand Palace and the adjoining royal temple, Wat Phra Khai, were completed in 1784.
Okay, and that allowed for the transfer of the Emerald Buddha, the most sacred palladium of the kingdom, into its new sanctuary.
Yes. The following year, in 1785, Rama I held a full coronation ceremony and officially named the new city Rattanakosin.
Which translates to the Jewel of Indra.
Right, acting as a direct reference to the Emerald Buddha residing at its core.
The name itself elevates the city from a strategic, muddy stronghold to a realm of divine status. I want to understand the man at the center of this new universe.
King Rama I.
Yeah. If you are King Rama I, sitting in a newly built palace surrounded by salvaged bricks and nervous subjects, how do you project the kind of authority needed to hold it all together? I mean, how did the concept of kingship actually function at this foundation level?
What is particularly notable here is the deeply complex dual nature of Siamese kingship during this period. On one side of the coin, you have the heavy, ancient influence of the Hindu-derived god-king cult.
Okay, so a Hindu influence.
Yes, the enthronement ceremony itself, known as the Rajabhiseka, is a profoundly Brahmanistic ritual, not a Buddhist one.
How does that work?
Well, to ascend the throne, the king must sit upon an octagonal figwood throne. He receives a purifying bath using sacred waters drawn meticulously from 5 specific rivers and 4 central ponds across the realm.
That is very specific.
It is. The high Brahmins of the court then recite an ancient Tamil mantra designed to open the Omkara portal.
The Omkara portal, what is that exactly?
It is a metaphysical gateway intended to invite the Hindu god Shiva to descend and physically merge with the king's mortal person. Through this ritual, the king is elevated to a living deity on earth. He becomes the Chao Chuit, which translates literally as the Lord of Life.
So under that framework, his word is not just policy, it is absolute, infallible law. He theoretically owns every single square inch of land in the kingdom, and he holds the unmitigated power of life and death over every person within it.
Precisely. That is the autocratic foundation. However, Rama I recognized that a mandate built solely on divine intimidation was brittle.
Right. People need more than just fear.
So he actively balanced this deified status with a highly visible reliance on orthodox Theravada Buddhism to justify his right to rule. He presented himself to his subjects as a Dharmaraja.
A Dharma-upholding king.
Exactly. This concept dictates that while the king's power is absolute, his authority is strictly and morally bound by the Tamasat, the traditional cosmic and moral law.
So there are rules he has to follow, conceptually.
Yes. To prove his commitment to this role, he ordered a vast scholarly recompilation of all existing legal texts into the Three Seals Law in 1804.
The Three Seals Law, what was the goal there?
The goal was to cleanse the legal code of centuries of corruptions and contradictions, aligning the laws of the state strictly with Buddhist principles of justice and righteousness. It was a calculated method of grounding his absolute power in a framework of moral responsibility.
And he needed every single ounce of that unquestionable authority because the existential threat that prompted the creation of Bangkok had not disappeared at all.
Not even slightly.
In 1785, the very year he officially named the city, the Burmese launched a colossal offensive known as the Nine Armies War.
King Bhattapaya of Burma dispatched a staggering force of 144,000 troops.
And their intent was to invade Siam simultaneously from 5 different geographical directions.
Right. And Siam, which was still severely depopulated and recovering from decades of prior conflict, could only muster a defense force of about 70,000 men.
So they're looking at an enemy that outnumbers them more than 2 to 1, attacking from multiple fronts.
The tactical situation was deeply perilous. However, the logistics of coordinating a 144,000-man invasion across some of the most dense, mountainous, and malaria-ridden jungle terrain in the world during the late 18th century were a nightmare.
I can only imagine.
Ultimately, it was this logistical ambition that proved to be the Burmese' undoing. They were severely overstretched. Their supply lines were incredibly fragile, relying on foraging and slow-moving caravans through thick underbrush.
So they could not converge those 5 separate armies effectively.
No, they could not. For the Siamese, survival depended entirely on exploiting this flaw through extreme tactical mobility. They had to strike the vulnerable, isolated columns of the Burmese advance before they could unify.
It is the classic military strategy of defeating a larger force in detail.
Exactly. Prince Sirasinghanat, who was Rama I's younger brother and held the powerful title of the Vice King of the Front Palace, led the primary Siamese forces to a critical, bloody victory at the Battle of Laktia in the province of Kanchanaburi.
By intercepting and shattering the main central Burmese army there, the entire invasion plan fractured.
Right. From that pivotal victory, the Siamese forces engaged in a rapid series of maneuvers, relieving besieged towns like Lana Lempang in the north and violently fending off naval and land attacks down in the southern peninsula at Thalang.
So Siam survived this onslaught solely because they managed to sever the Burmese supply chains and dismantle the armies piece by piece in the jungle.
Yes. That definitive victory over the 9 armies effectively solidified the legitimacy and permanence of the newly founded Chakri dynasty. But to truly understand how this secured kingdom functioned on a daily basis, we have to completely discard our modern, rigid conception of geography.
Okay, how so?
Well, pre-modern Southeast Asia did not operate with fixed, linear borders drawn neatly on a piece of paper.
This is a really crucial concept. So instead of a map with hard, undeniable lines like we use today, was the kingdom more like a Wi-Fi signal?
A Wi-Fi signal.
Yeah, like the signal is incredibly strong at the routers sitting in the Grand Palace in Bangkok. But the further out you travel into the jungles and mountains, the weaker the signal gets, and the more easily it can be intercepted or overwhelmed by a different router.
That analogy perfectly captures the political reality of the region. Historians refer to this as the Mandala system. The kingdom was not a territorial bloc. It was a fluid network of tributary relationships.
So Bangkok served as the center of power, and radiating outward were various semi-independent polities.
Exactly. You had the Lana Kingdom up in the mountainous north, the Lao kingdoms of Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak across the Mekong River to the east, and the various Malay sultanates deep in the southern peninsula, such as Kedah, Kelantan, and Terengganu.
And these tributary states were not heavily garrisoned or micromanaged by Bangkok, right?
No, not at all. They entirely retained their native cultures, their indigenous languages, their local legal systems, and their own hereditary rulers.
They simply had to acknowledge that the router in Bangkok was the supreme power in the region.
Right. And the mechanism for this acknowledgement was highly ritualized. The local lords had to periodically send ceremonial trees meticulously crafted from solid gold and silver to the King of Siam.
That is quite the visual. And more practically, they were required to provide armed troops whenever Bangkok went to war, and they had to funnel valuable local resources and forest products back to the capital.
That is the core of the obligation. But because the boundaries were entirely fluid, based on personal allegiance rather than geographical lines, these spheres of influence your Wi-Fi signals frequently overlapped with the signals projecting from neighboring rival empires.
Which inevitably breeds friction.
Yes.
Right, you have multiple routers trying to force a connection to the same device, and eventually the system crashes into conflict.
And the most violent, prolonged conflicts over these overlapping spheres of influence occurred with the Vietnamese Empire over the deeply contested territory of Cambodia.
Because geographically, Cambodia was trapped directly between the Siamese sphere expanding eastward and the Vietnamese sphere expanding westward.
The Cambodian royal court was essentially caught in a vice. Cambodian kings would frequently and desperately flick their allegiances depending on which neighbor possessed a stronger army at any given moment.
Alternatively, rival Cambodian princes would actively seek military backing from either Bangkok or Saigon to overthrow their own relatives.
Exactly. It turned the entire country of Cambodia into a brutal generational proxy battleground for 2 larger empires.
And the human cost of this arrangement must have been severe.
It was. There were protracted military campaigns, grinding sieges of fortified towns, and heavy casualties on all sides. Consider the Siamese-Vietnamese War that flared up intensely in 1833.
What happened there?
Well, Siam launched an extensive military expedition attempting to force a pro-Siamese monarch onto the Cambodian throne. This sparked years of naval engagements along the coast and grueling land campaigns through the dense interior.
And ultimately, these exhaustive proxy wars often burned themselves out into a tense stalemate.
Right. The resolution was frequently a bizarre diplomatic compromise known as joint suzerainty.
Under this system, the battered Cambodian king was forced to endure the humiliation of paying formal tribute to both the King of Siam and the Emperor of Vietnam simultaneously.
It was a delicate, highly volatile balancing act that defined regional politics.
That paints a very vivid picture of the chaotic geopolitics on the periphery. But let us refocus on the internal engine of this society, right at the core. How did the average person actually fit into this fluid, expansive system?
The society within the core of the kingdom was rigidly stratified, and its entire structure was based not on the ownership of land, but on the strict control of manpower.
Because in the expansive river valleys of Siam, land was immensely abundant, but human beings to work that land were scarce.
Precisely. To solve this, the state developed a highly complex system called Sakdina. This system assigned a specific, formal numerical rank to every single individual in the kingdom, explicitly dictating their exact place in the social hierarchy.
It is a literal, codified quantification of human worth. The state is assigning a point value to your existence.
That is exactly how it functioned. The numerical unit was called the rai, which is also a measurement of land, but in this context, it represented a unit of social weight.
Okay, so how did the numbers break down?
Well, a slave, positioned at the very bottom of the hierarchy, known as a naik, was assigned a sakdina of exactly 5 rai. A commoner, or fry, possessed a higher number, typically between 10 and 25.
And monks.
A basic, fully ordained Buddhist monk was granted 400. As you moved up into the nobility, the munai, the numbers escalated dramatically, reaching up to 10,000 rei for the highest-ranking ministers.
And this assigned number was not just a title. I mean, it determined every facet of your life.
It dictated your legal standing in court, the severity of the fines you paid, the level of respect you were owed, and theoretically the amount of land you were permitted to control.
The commoners, the fry, constituted the vast, overwhelming majority of the population. And their primary function in this system was that they owed the state their physical labor.
This was not a modern tax system where you hand over a percentage of your income. It was a system of universal, mandatory conscription.
The state demanded the sweat off your back.
Right, and this labor was not solely reserved for military service during wartime. The fray were the engine that built the temples, dug the vital irrigation canals, constructed the city walls, and maintained the regional garrisons.
And the system categorized them based on who owned their time, right?
Yes. You had the Frey Long, who were bound directly to the king, required to work alternating months for the state, essentially giving up half their year.
Wow, half the year.
Then you had the Frey Som, who were allocated to serve specific royal princes or high-ranking nobles.
And what about the people living far away from the capital?
They were the Frey Swai, who lived deep in the provinces, too far away to practically travel to Bangkok for physical labor. To fulfill their obligation, they paid a heavy tax in valuable, locally sourced goods, such as ivory, cardamom, or high-quality timber.
The inherent problem with this system is human nature. Very few people willingly desire to abandon their own farms, leave their families, and spend up to 6 months of the year performing grueling, unpaid, often dangerous labor for a distant king.
No, of course not.
Because the kingdom beyond the immediate river valleys was mostly dense, untamed tropical jungle, absconding into the wilderness and forming undocumented settlements was a highly viable, frequently utilized method of avoiding this corvée labor.
And the state, constantly desperate for manpower, needed a foolproof, inescapable method to strictly track its population.
And this necessity puts one of the most visceral, intense details of this entire era. I'm talking about the Saklek process.
Yes.
To prevent men from slipping into the jungle, the government would conduct a sweeping demographic census, typically once a generation. When the officials located an able-bodied commoner man, they did not just write his name on a ledger, they literally branded him.
The officials used a heated iron cast to sear an imprinting tattoo directly into the flesh on the back of his hand or his wrist.
That is just, it is hard to conceptualize.
The physical pain of the process was secondary to its administrative purpose. That permanent brand indicated exactly which specific government department or noble lord he belonged to.
It was an indelible biological barcode.
Exactly. Without that specific brand on his flesh, a man possessed no legal existence whatsoever within the kingdom.
He could not own property, he could not legally marry, and he could not seek justice or protection in any royal court.
Right. If he was caught unbranded, he was considered a vagrant and could be immediately enslaved by the state. It was a harsh, violently physical method of ensuring the state maintained the critical manpower it required to function, build, and survive.
So we have an agrarian society entirely dependent on the physical extraction of labor and the gathering of raw resources from the forests. How did the kingdom actually generate wealth?
Good question.
I mean, how did the economy function in these early formative days in Bangkok?
In the early decades of the Rattanakosin period, particularly under the reigns of Rama I and Rama II, the economy was not a free market. It was heavily and fiercely managed by the crown.
The royal court maintained a strict, unbreakable monopoly on all lucrative foreign trade.
Yes. This monopoly was enforced through a powerful institution known as the Phra Klang Sinka, or the Royal Warehouse.
So foreign merchants arriving from India, the Middle East, or Europe could not simply sail up the river, dock their ships, and negotiate prices directly with local Siamese farmers or tradesmen.
No, they were legally mandated to conduct all their business exclusively through the Royal Warehouse, which rigidly controlled the supply of goods, set non-negotiable prices, and levied exceedingly heavy tariffs on everything coming in or going out.
The crown was acting as the ultimate, inescapable middleman, and their primary vehicle for generating extensive amounts of revenue was through the deployment of the Samphel Luang, the royal junks.
The royal court would utilize the corvée labor we discussed to extract valuable forest products from the deep interior items highly prized abroad, such as fragrant agar wood, sappan wood used for deep red dyes, raw tin, and exotic animal hides.
And they would load these bulk commodities onto fleets of enormous state-owned junks and sail them across the South China Sea to sell directly in the lucrative markets of Qing Dynasty China.
The economic relationship with King China was the vital, beating heart of the early Siamese economy. However, the exact nature of this relationship was understood and interpreted entirely differently by the two respective courts.
Yes, and this is where the history reveals a highly strategic piece of statecraft. This is where Siam treats the most powerful empire in Asia with a sustained diplomatic wink.
A diplomatic wink is a great way to describe it.
To the Chinese emperor sitting in the Forbidden City in Beijing, Siam was unequivocally viewed as a submissive vassal state.
When the Siamese ships arrived, the Chinese court recorded it as Siam sending official tribute, known as Chim Kong, to properly acknowledge Chinese cultural and political superiority.
And the emperor, in his benevolence, would then bestow lavish gifts upon the Siamese envoys in return. But the Chakri kings, sitting in Bangkok, viewed this dynamic through a completely different lens.
To them, this was not about submission. It was entirely about maintaining a highly profitable, state-sponsored gift exchange business.
The tribute was just the necessary entry fee to access the closed Chinese market.
Exactly. To ensure this lucrative trade continued without interruption, the early Chakri kings went so far as to use a Chinese surname, Zheng, in all their formal diplomatic letters to the emperor.
Right, they deliberately claimed direct familial descent from the previous Siamese king, Taksin, who actually was of Chinese descent, even though they had overthrown him.
They adopted a fake lineage just to satisfy Chinese bureaucratic protocols and keep the silver flowing.
It was a deeply pragmatic, highly successful diplomatic performance. The immense profits generated by those royal junks funded the physical reconstruction of the kingdom, the building of the new temples, and the equipping of the armies.
However, economies are rarely static. By the time King Rama III ascended the throne in 1824, this state-run system began to show severe signs of strain.
Because the large, cumbersome royal junks were increasingly facing stiff, agile competition from private Chinese shipping networks operating out of southern coastal ports.
Right. The state-run expeditions became slower and noticeably less profitable. Rama III, recognizing the shifting economic tides, realized the state urgently required a new, more efficient revenue stream that did not rely on the unpredictable winds of the South China Sea.
And his solution is a major pivot. He implements what is essentially an outsourced, franchised tax collection network, This becomes known as the Chinese tax collector system.
Exactly. Instead of the state attempting to manage the complex, localized trade of every market and village, the crown began to option off the exclusive right to collect taxes on specific commodities or regional activities.
And Chinese merchants, who were immigrating to Siam in increasingly large numbers to escape poverty and conflict in their homeland, would fiercely bid against each other for these lucrative rights.
The merchant who submitted the highest bid won the franchise for a specific sector. They paid the crown the pledged amount up front, guaranteeing the state its revenue, and then they were legally authorized to extract that tax from the populace, keeping whatever extra profit they could squeeze out of the system.
And they cast an incredibly wide net. They did not just tax luxury goods, they taxed everything that moved or was consumed.
They secured monopolies on the production of alcohol, the operation of gambling dens, the harvesting of fruit orchards, the fisheries in the rivers, and even the right to collect birds' nests from coastal caves.
This profound economic shift triggered deep demographic and social consequences that would reshape the kingdom.
The booming economy fueled by this tax farming system encouraged a vast influx of Chinese immigrants, primarily arriving from the Guangdong and Fujian provinces of southern China.
And the Siamese state, recognizing their economic utility, treated these immigrants uniquely.
Yes. Unlike the native Fray population, who were subjected to the brutal Saklek branding and the exhausting demands of corvée labor, the Chinese immigrants were granted a crucial exemption.
Instead of being forced to dig canals or march into war, they simply paid a special localized poll tax called the Phúc Pi.
And the physical manifestation of this payment is quite notable. Once a Chinese immigrant paid the tax, the official would take a small, specific amulet and tightly tie it around the immigrant's wrist with a piece of string.
As long as they wore that amulet, it was undeniable proof that they were completely exempt from state labor.
That simple string granted them something the native population did not have: freedom of movement and enterprise.
This exemption allowed the Chinese immigrants to travel freely up and down the intricate river systems, trade goods between provinces, and manage the sprawling networks of the tax farms.
This dynamic sparked the rapid growth of a vibrant, commercial middle class that had not previously existed in the rigid two-tier system of nobles and serfs.
By 1850, this explosion of internal economic activity had fueled the population growth of Bangkok to over 100,000 residents, transforming it from a defensive fortress into a bustling cosmopolitan hub of commerce.
But this complex, carefully balanced internal ecosystem was about to collide violently with a global force that it absolutely could not control or manipulate.
The geopolitical landscape of the entire Asian continent was shifting drastically.
The British Empire was expanding its reach aggressively from India, and the devastating results of the First Opium War in China demonstrated a terrifying reality.
Western military technology and naval superiority could effortlessly shatter ancient Asian empires.
The European powers were aggressively seeking open markets and free trade across the globe. And Siam's royal warehouse monopoly, combined with its heavy restrictive tariffs, stood as major frustrating obstacles to British commercial ambitions.
The initial attempts to open Siam were diplomatic but very tense. In 1822, the British East India Company dispatched an envoy named John Crawford to Bangkok to negotiate a free trade agreement.
He was met with intense, stonewalling resistance from the Siamese court. The court utilized a highly prohibitive system of tariffs called the Fazi Pakriwa, which translated to measurement duties.
Under this system, taxes were not levied based on the value of the cargo inside the ship, but simply on the physical width of the ship's beam.
Right.
I want to emphasize how restrictive this is. If you are a British merchant and you sail a large, deep-water merchant galleon up the Chao Phraya River, you are forced to pay an absolute fortune in taxes just for the privilege of dropping anchor before you have even unloaded or sold a single crate of goods.
It made large-scale Western trade financially ruinous.
Crawford leaves Bangkok entirely frustrated, having achieved almost nothing. A few years later, in 1826, another envoy, Henry Burney, manages to negotiate the Burney Treaty.
This agreement chips away at the edges, breaking a few minor royal monopolies, but those crushing measurement tariffs remain firmly in place.
The true tipping point, the moment the dam breaks, does not arrive until 1855.
In 1855, Sir John Bowring arrives in Bangkok, explicitly representing the full might of the British government.
He does not arrive as a humble petitioner. He arrives bringing the full, implicit threat of British naval power.
The Siamese knew perfectly well what British gunboats had done to the Chinese coast. But crucially, Bowring also meets a uniquely prepared and highly perceptive Siamese leadership. King Mongkut, known as Rama IV, is now sitting on the throne.
And Mongkut is one of the most compelling figures of the entire century. Before he became king, he spent 27 years living as a fully ordained Buddhist monk.
And he did not just spend those 3 decades meditating. He utilized his time in the monastery to voraciously study the outside world.
He learned Latin, he mastered English, and he deeply studied Western physical sciences, geography, and astronomy, which is how we get the eclipse story from the beginning of our deep dive.
Because of this education, he possessed a crystal-clear, unclouded understanding of exactly what the West was capable of militarily and technologically.
Mongkut, alongside his deeply pragmatic chief minister, Chafarayasi Suryawong, looked at the regional map and recognized a harsh, undeniable reality. Siam could not militarily resist the British Empire and hope to survive.
They had studied the recent history. They had seen the Qing Empire humbled in the Opium Wars, and they had watched the British systematically annex large swaths of neighboring Burma.
Faced with a choice between yielding their economic isolation or facing total annihilation, they deliberately chose accommodation.
So Bowring shows up with British warships looming in the background.
I am assuming he's not just asking politely for lower taxes to facilitate a bit of friendly trade. He essentially puts a diplomatic gun to Siam's head.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Bowring Treaty of 1855 is universally considered the watershed moment that created modern Siam.
What was the actual ultimatum, and what were the specific mechanics of what Bowring demanded?
The terms of the treaty were sweeping, non-negotiable, and designed to entirely dismantle the Siamese economic defense system. First, it demanded the total, immediate abolition of the Fazi Pakurua, those prohibitive measurement duties based on ship size.
Okay, so the beam width tax is gone.
Second, it mandated that all import tariffs be drastically slashed and capped at a flat rate of just 3%.
3%. The state could no longer control its own taxation on foreign goods.
But perhaps the most significant and deeply humiliating concession was the granting of extraterritoriality to British subjects.
I want to make sure the gravity of this concept lands. Extraterritoriality means that if a British subject, say a merchant or a sailor, gets drunk, destroys a local market stall in Bangkok, and violently assaults the Siamese owner.
So local Siamese police force is legally forbidden from arresting him.
Exactly. He cannot be tried by a Siamese judge or sentenced under Siamese law. He must be handed over to the British consul to be tried under British law, usually resulting in a mere fine.
It is a massive structural concession of national sovereignty. The state loses legal control over the people operating within its own borders.
It was the definition of an unequal treaty. And once the British kicked the door open, it was quickly followed by a rapid succession of nearly identical treaties forced upon Siam by the United States, France, and various other European powers.
The economic metamorphosis that followed these treaties was instantaneous, total, and deeply disruptive. Siam was violently yanked out of its centuries-old, internally focused subsistence agrarian model and thrust forcefully into the volatile currents of the global export market.
And the single commodity that came to define and dominate this new era was rice.
Previously, the large-scale export of rice was heavily restricted by the crown. The state wanted to ensure there was always a huge surplus of food to feed its own populace and supply its armies during times of war or famine. Exporting your primary food source was considered a national security risk.
But the Bowring Treaty entirely liberalized the rice trade, forbidding the state from restricting exports.
Suddenly, the Siamese farmers had direct access to an insatiable, booming demand for rice from heavily populated, food-deficit British colonies like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Malaya.
The physical landscape of central Siam was radically transformed in response to this market pressure.
Vast tracts of dense jungles and previously unusable marshlands in the Chao Phraya Basin were systematically cleared, drained, and converted into vast, endless plains of rice plantations.
The overall economy boomed as exports skyrocketed. But paradoxically, the central government found itself in a dire financial crisis.
Because import tariffs were legally capped at 3%, the state's traditional, highly lucrative revenue streams vanished overnight.
The state was losing its primary source of income precisely at the historical moment when it desperately needed resources to build a modern infrastructure and field a modern military to defend itself against those same Western powers.
This critical revenue crisis sets the stage for the reign of the next pivotal figure, King Chulalongkorn, Rama V. He ascends the throne in 1868.
He is just 15 years old at the time.
Because he is a minor, the day-to-day administration of the kingdom is controlled by a powerful regent, the veteran minister, Suryawong.
This period of regency, while politically frustrating for the young king, provided him with an unprecedented, highly educational opportunity. Chulalongkorn became the very first Siamese king in history to travel extensively abroad.
He journeyed to the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Java, to meticulously study the structure of Dutch colonial administration. He then traveled to India to observe the mechanics of the British Raj.
He was not just touring, he was studying. He observed firsthand how modern rationalized bureaucracies functioned, how large-scale infrastructure like railways and telegraphs were managed, and crucially, how colonial states effectively centralized their tax revenues.
When he finally assumes full, unmitigated power upon reaching his majority in 1873, he is armed with these detailed observations, and he unleashes a relentless wave of sweeping centralization.
He looks at the archaic administrative structure of Siam, the centuries-old Chatusadam.
These were the four traditional ministries that had run the kingdom since the Ayutthaya period, and he realizes they are hopelessly overlapping, inefficient, and deeply controlled by entrenched, wealthy, noble families who operate them like personal fiefdoms.
He recognizes that to survive, the state must be streamlined. He begins systematically dismantling the Chatusadam.
In its place, he creates a modern, functional cabinet system modeled on European governments, featuring highly specialized ministries with distinct purviews.
So a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a Ministry of Justice, a Ministry of Education, and a centrally commanded modern military.
But his most pressing issue was financial. To solve the revenue crisis caused by the unequal treaties and the rampant corruption of the outsourced Chinese tax farmers, he establishes a completely new institution in 1873, the Rattanakosin Kingdom.
The Financial Auditory Office.
Right. This office effectively cuts the corrupt independent tax farmers out of the loop. It mandates that all tax revenues collected across the kingdom must flow directly into the central royal treasury, audited by the state.
He is centralizing the wealth of the entire nation under his direct singular control, stripping the regional nobles of their independent financial power.
But here's where it gets particularly notable, because while he is aggressively reforming the cold machinery of government, he is also undertaking a profound reform of the very fabric of human society.
He makes the monumental decision to abolish slavery.
The institution of slavery was deeply ingrained. That slaves constituted a highly significant portion of the total population, and they were the primary economic asset of the powerful noble class.
An outright, immediate decree of abolition would have triggered a severe economic collapse and almost certainly provoked a violent armed rebellion by the elites who owned them.
Chulalongkorn's approach to this volatile issue was an absolute masterclass in gradual, meticulously calculated political reform.
Instead of a sudden, disruptive emancipation proclamation, he passes a highly specific law concerning the future generation.
He dictates that the legally defined redemption price of a child born into slavery would begin to steadily and mathematically decline as they grew older.
If you picture it as a graph, the value of a human being slowly slopes downward over 2 decades. By the time that specific child reached the age of 21, their financial value on the ledger would hit absolute zero, and they would be entirely legally free.
It was a phased, multi-generational approach that allowed the nobles to adjust to the economic reality without facing an immediate shock to their wealth.
It was a long game, but highly effective. By 1905, the legal institution of slavery was completely and permanently eradicated within the borders of Siam.
Alongside this abolition, Chulalongkorn systematically dismantled the traditional Freikorps labor system. The state no longer needed men to dig canals by hand. It needed cash to hire professional labor and buy modern rifles.
He replaced the archaic forced labor with a modern, predictable capitation tax paid in currency and instituted a system of universal military conscription to build a professional standing national army.
The entire foundation of the state transitioned from extracting direct physical sweat to extracting financial capital.
But even as the internal state grew stronger and more cohesive, the external existential threat of Western imperialism was closing in like a vice.
The French were aggressively expanding their colonial holdings from Vietnam westward into Cambodian territory, and the British were steadily encroaching eastward from Burma and northward from their holdings in Malaya.
This intense geopolitical pressure forced a fundamental conceptual shift in how the Siamese state viewed its own territory.
The old mandala system, we discussed the Wi-Fi router analogy, with its fluid overlapping boundaries and semi-independent tributary states, was entirely incompatible with the rigid, legalistic Western concept of the modern nation-state.
European empires demanded treaties based on maps, with hard, surveyed, immutable lines. If a piece of land was not clearly defined on a map as belonging to Bangkok, the French or British felt perfectly justified in claiming it.
To survive in a world defined by European cartography, Siam had to draw its own lines. To deal with this, Chulalongkorn's half-brother and Minister of the Interior, Prince Damrong, proposed and implemented the Thesafaban system.
This was the death knell of the old ways. They completely abolished the ancient tributary mandala system.
They took the semi-independent, culturally distinct regions like the Lana Kingdom up in the mountainous north and the vast Lao-speaking areas in the northeast plateau and integrated them directly and forcefully into the central state apparatus.
They carved the map into monthons, which were new provincial administrative units ruled directly by salaried commissioners, appointed and dispatched directly from Bangkok.
The local hereditary lords were stripped of their real power, given pensions, and reduced to figureheads.
Siam was rapidly consolidating its core territory, deliberately transforming a loose, decentralized empire into a tightly defined, legally defensible geo-body. But this forced consolidation came at a deeply painful, heavy price.
The defining crisis of this territorial struggle occurred in 1893, during the Franco-Siamese War, an event most often referred to as the Paknam Incident.
This is the moment the threat becomes terrifyingly physical. French naval gunboats literally forced their way past the coastal forts, sail directly up the Chao Phraya River, drop anchor, and point their heavy artillery directly at the Grand Palace in the heart of Bangkok.
The threat of total subjugation was absolute and immediate. The Siamese military could not match the French naval guns.
To save the independence of the core Siamese state and remove the gunboats from their capital, King Chulalongkorn was forced to concede extensive swaths of peripheral territory.
In the resulting, bitterly negotiated treaties, Siam formally ceded all of its historic claims to the vast territories of Laos, situated east of the Mekong River, handing them over to French Indochina.
It was a brutal act of geopolitical triage. They had to cut off an arm to save the body. And this pattern continued over the next decade.
Siam systematically relinquished its claims over its peripheral tributary states in a desperate bid to secure internationally recognized borders for its core.
In 1907, they signed a treaty ceding the lush northwestern provinces of Cambodia, including the area housing the ruins of Angkor Wat, directly to France.
2 years later, in 1909, they signed the Anglo-Siamese Treaty, formally ceding their suzerainty over 4 northern Malay sultanates, Kedah, Kelantan, Terengganu, and Perlis, handing them over to British Malaya.
But these cessions were not merely surrenders. They were highly calculated diplomatic trades.
In exchange for relinquishing the Malay states, the British provided a vital loan of £4 million to finance the construction of a modern southern railway system, tying the peninsula to Bangkok.
More crucially, the British agreed to surrender the majority of their devastating extraterritorial rights within Siam.
The Siamese grand strategy was essentially to trade vast expanses of peripheral land in exchange for the restoration of their domestic legal autonomy and the establishment of clearly defined, internationally recognized borders.
Siam emerged from this period significantly smaller on the map, but legally stronger, more centralized, and crucially, internationally recognized as a sovereign, independent buffer state, sitting precariously between the British and French colonial empires.
While the physical map of the country was being violently redrawn, the culture residing within those new borders was evolving just as rapidly.
The 19th century saw profound, systemic, religious, and cultural reforms. Let us jump back to King Mongkut for a moment.
Yeah.
Remember those 27 years he spent as a monk before taking the throne?
We must look at what he actually did during those decades. During his extended time in the monkhood, Mongkut traveled extensively and grew deeply intellectually dissatisfied with the mainstream Siamese Buddhist practices of the era.
He observed that many monks were highly lax in their monastic discipline.
He felt the institution was overly concerned with elaborate rote rituals and had become heavily diluted by local animist folklore, astrology, and superstition, drifting far away from the core, original teachings of the Buddha.
He looks at the state of religion and decides it needs the same rigorous modernization that the state requires. So he essentially founds his own highly orthodox reform movement, which becomes known as the Temyat order.
He demands strict, unyielding adherence to the Vinaya, the ancient monastic code of conduct. He even changes the physical appearance of his followers, dictating a new way the monks wear their robes, adopting the Mon style where the brownish-red cloth is worn draped over both shoulders rather than just one, signaling a return to austerity.
But the reform was much deeper than aesthetics. The Tamiat movement prioritized the rigorous scholarly study of original Pali texts.
Mongkut's goal was to methodically strip away the accumulated magical practices, the amulets and the protective tattoos, and return the religion to a rational, textual, and highly philosophical understanding of Buddhism.
It was a movement of a religious modernization that intellectually mirrored and justified the political centralization and modernization happening simultaneously within the state apparatus.
This compelling cultural evolution is not just confined to the temples. It is highly visible in the physical art and architecture of the period.
If you look closely at the buildings, you can read the economic history of the kingdom. During the reign of Rama III, decades before Mongkut, there was an influx of Chinese trade and influence.
This economic reality gives birth to a highly unique Sino-Siamese architectural fusion, known as the Phra Ratchanium style.
Prior to this era, traditional Siamese temples heavily featured sweeping, intricately carved, and heavily gilded woody decorations on their gables, often depicting ancient Hindu deities or mythological creatures.
Rama III deliberately replaced this flammable, decaying wooden aesthetic with solid masonry and highly durable stucco. But the most striking innovation was the use of imported Chinese ceramics.
A perfect example of this is Wat Ratchaorad. You walk up to this temple, and instead of carved wooden nagas or deities on the gables, you see these beautiful, intricate, blooming floral patterns.
But when you get closer, you realize those flowers are made entirely out of broken pieces of Chinese porcelain bowls and spoons, set meticulously into the plaster.
The ships returning from China used cheap pottery as ballast to weigh down the hulls. The Siamese took that heavy, broken ballast and turned it into the defining artistic motif of the era.
It is a physical manifestation of the economic ties between the two empires. And as the century progressed and Western influence rapidly increased, entirely new technologies arrived on the shores of Siam, fundamentally altering how the society viewed itself.
In 1845, a French Catholic missionary, Bishop Palaguay, introduced the daguerreotype, the earliest practical form of photography, to the Siamese court.
The initial reaction to this technology was one of deep, visceral fear. There was a widespread superstition among the populace that taking a photograph was a dark act of magic that would literally entrap a piece of your vital soul onto the glass plate, physically weakening you and significantly shortening your lifespan.
But the royal elite, deeply eager to project an image of a sophisticated, civilized, and technologically adept modern nation to the watching world, aggressively embraced the camera.
We soon see the rise of Francis Chit, the very first native Siamese professional photographer. He opened a commercial studio in Bangkok and spent decades meticulously documenting the rapidly changing kingdom.
He photographed the newly built temples, the royal family in both traditional regalia and Western military uniforms, and the very physical landscape that was being transformed by canals and railways.
The linguistic landscape of the kingdom was also shifting to accommodate the demands of this complex new world. King Mongkut, ever the innovator, even went so far as to invent an entirely new alphabet, the Aryaka script.
It was heavily based on Roman alphabets and was specifically intended to make the printing of complex Buddhist texts on modern European printing presses more efficient.
While that specific script did not catch on widely with the public, the broader language was undergoing a massive organic evolution.
The influx of hundreds of thousands of Chinese immigrants over the century left a permanent structural mark on the spoken and written language.
As thousands of necessary Chinese loanwords, words for commerce, food, and new tools flooded into the daily vocabulary of Bangkok, the Thai language had to actively adapt its structure to accurately accommodate the specific tonal sounds of the Southern Min Chinese dialects.
This linguistic necessity actually prompted the creation and formal integration of two entirely new tone markers into the complex Thai written language, the Maitri and the Mai Chatawa.
These specific phonetic markers were introduced into the grammar strictly to accurately represent the high and rising tones of these newly integrated foreign words.
The entire culture, from its highest religious philosophies down to the very mechanics of its alphabet, was constantly absorbing, adapting, and evolving to manage external pressures.
Which brings us to the complex, turbulent final act of the absolute monarchy. The year is 1910, and King Vajirabhut, known as Rama VI, takes the throne.
He is a profoundly different kind of monarch than his predecessors. He did not grow up observing the empire from a monastery.
He was sent abroad at a young age and extensively educated at Oxford University, becoming deeply immersed in the culture, literature, and political thought of Edwardian Britain.
Vajiravoot ascended the throne at a moment of transition. He recognized that the immediate, overt geopolitical threats of the 19th century, the French and British gunboats, were fading as the borders were finalized.
However, a completely new, potent internal threat was rapidly rising, the growing ideological demand for political participation from the populace. His strategic response to this pressure was not democratization, but the deliberate forging of a top-down, fiercely elite brand of state nationalism.
He needed a way to bind the newly centralized state together emotionally. So he introduced the official national trinity chat, Satsana, from Mahakasat, which translates to nation, religion, and monarchy.
It is the highly structured Siamese equivalent of the British God, king, and country. To instill these values across the kingdom, he mandated compulsory primary education for all children, ensuring the state controlled the curriculum.
Furthermore, he enacted a sweeping law requiring every single citizen to adopt a family surname. Prior to this, commoners generally only had a single given name.
By forcing surnames, he tied every family legally, administratively, and conceptually to the centralized state apparatus.
His overarching goal was to actively manufacture a unified populace under a shared, fiercely patriotic identity, an identity that he ensured was exclusively linked to the absolute, unquestionable authority of the king himself.
But Vajiravoot's reign was characterized by deep, often baffling contradictions between his Western education and his autocratic instincts.
Yes, this is where his behavior becomes incredibly difficult to parse. On one hand, you have a king who is clearly intellectually fascinated by the mechanics of Western democracy.
He goes so far as to build a literal, highly detailed miniature mock town called Dusit Thani right on the grounds of the royal palace.
It was not just a model, it was a role-playing exercise. He held fake elections, established a model parliament with miniature political parties, and even allowed the publication of two competing miniature daily newspapers.
Yet, simultaneously, in the real world outside the palace walls, he creates a large, personal paramilitary force called the Wild Tiger Corps, completely bypassing the chain of command of the regular National Army.
And when actual real-world newspapers begin to gently criticize his government's policies, he enacts incredibly strict, punitive laws against press freedom. How do we possibly reconcile a monarch playing with toy democracies while unleashing paramilitary forces to intimidate his own subjects?
This raises a profoundly important question about the fundamental limits of absolute reform. Vajiravoot was intellectually curious about the theoretical mechanics of Western political systems, hence the toy town. But he remained fundamentally, fiercely committed to the preservation of his own absolute divine right to rule.
He firmly believed that the Siamese populace was simply not ready or mature enough for actual messy democracy.
His creation of the Wild Tiger Corps was a disastrous miscalculation. By pouring state funds into a personal militia, he deeply alienated the professional, regular military officers who felt slighted and underfunded.
This resentment directly fueled an aborted, highly organized coup attempt in 1912, led by junior army officers who wanted a constitution.
Furthermore, his aggressive suppression of the press alienated the very demographic the state had spent decades deliberately cultivating.
And that is the ultimate, inescapable irony of this entire era of modernization. Over the previous 4 decades, the royal government had intentionally sent hundreds of intelligent, capable commoners abroad on government-funded scholarships.
They were sent to the universities of Paris, London, and Berlin to study modern law, civil engineering, economics, and advanced military tactics.
The state's explicitly stated goal was to build a highly educated, modern bureaucracy capable of running a 20th century nation.
But you cannot send capable young students to the cafes of Paris or the halls of London to learn modern administrative law without them also deeply absorbing Western democratic ideals, constitutional theory, and the powerful concepts of civil rights and equality.
These scholarship students returned to Siam as a highly educated, intensely capable middle class. They were perfectly equipped to run a modern nation, but upon returning home, they found themselves entirely locked out of meaningful political power.
The highest echelons of government, the cabinet positions, and the ultimate decision-making authority were still strictly monopolized by the extended royal family and the high hereditary nobility. They hid an unbreakable glass ceiling of royal blood.
Despite this internal friction, the state continued to maneuver on the global stage. During World War I, Vajirud made the highly calculated, ultimately wise decision to join the conflict on the side of the Allies, sending a token force of motor transport and aviation troops to the battlefields of Europe.
This participation earned Siam a seat at the Versailles Peace Conference. It gave them the crucial diplomatic leverage needed to finally, painstakingly renegotiate those devastating unequal treaties imposed by Bowring decades earlier.
Allowing them to gradually regain their full legal sovereignty and fiscal autonomy throughout the 1920s. But while the external pressures eased, the internal pressure cooker was rapidly reaching a boiling point.
By the time King Prajatapak, Rama VII, inherits the throne in 1925, the structural flaws of the absolute monarchy are fully exposed.
He inherits a kingdom facing a severe, crippling financial crisis.
This was partly a hangover from the lavish, unchecked spending and massive bureaucratic expansion of Vajirava's reign, and partly the dark looming shadow of the impending global Great Depression, which was beginning to severely depress the price of rice exports.
Prajatapak is backed into a corner, and he has to implement incredibly deep, highly painful economic austerities. To balance the royal budget, he drastically slashes government funding across the board, forcibly merges entire administrative departments, and executes massive layoffs, firing thousands of civil servants and military officers without warning.
These necessary but brutal budget cuts acted as the final catalyst. They deeply alienated the two most dangerous, capable groups within the kingdom.
The professional military, whose essential funding and prestige were suddenly slashed.
And that newly educated, foreign-trained, bureaucratic middle class, who now found themselves unexpectedly unemployed, deeply frustrated, and trapped in an autocratic system that offered them absolutely no voice in the decisions destroying their livelihoods.
The climax of this century-long transformation arrives on the morning of the 24th of June, 1932.
A highly organized, secretive group calling themselves the Kana Ratsadan, or the People's Party, executes their plan.
It is a stunningly small group, consisting of just 49 military officers and civilian bureaucrats. Taking advantage of the fact that King Prajatapak is away resting at his seaside summer palace in Hua Hin, they stage a brilliant, entirely bloodless mutiny in the heart of Bangkok.
They seize control of the vital communications infrastructure, lock down the capital, arrest key royalist military commanders, and issue a bold ultimatum demanding the immediate implementation of a constitution.
King Prajatapak, faced with a military standoff, recognizing the undeniable permanent shift in the balance of power, and desperately wishing to avoid a bloody civil war in the streets of his capital, makes a fateful decision.
He yields entirely to the demands of the Kana Ratsadon. He accepts their drafted constitution, agreeing to permanently surrender his absolute authority and share power with a newly formed national parliament and a prime minister.
And just like that, with the signing of the document, 800 unyielding years of divine absolute monarchy in Siam comes to a sudden end.
The kingdom transitions permanently into a constitutional monarchy, stepping out of the age of god-kings and into a new, highly complex and frequently turbulent era of modern constitutional politics.
The entire arc of the Rattanakosin era, from the muddy foundation of Bangkok in 1782 to the bloodless revolution of 1932, is a testament to extraordinary, ruthless resilience.
The Siamese state navigated a deeply perilous century of global upheaval by being willing to sacrifice its vast periphery to protect its vital core, and by meticulously adopting the scientific, administrative, and legal tools of its greatest adversaries to ultimately maintain its sovereign existence.
It is a phenomenal, incredibly complex historical journey. And as we wrap up our exploration of this era, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own.
When you look at a modern map of mainland Southeast Asia today, the borders of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Malaysia appear completely fixed, natural, and deeply historical.
But as we have seen, those specific lines were not drawn organically by shared culture, linguistic ties, or even natural geography. They were drawn directly as the result of a desperate, high-stakes game of diplomatic chess between a deeply traditional royal Siamese court and aggressive European empires looking to legally define their expanding colonial holdings. How much of the modern, fiercely guarded national identity in this entire region is actually just the lingering, arbitrary shadow of those 19th century colonial-era treaties? It's a profound question, one that forces us to re-examine the very foundations of how we look at the modern map of the world. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.